Emancipatory Future Studies public platform. This is one of many seminars that we've been having in this space. We are fortunate to have with us Professor Christopher Chase Dunn. And before I introduce him and get into a bit of introduce his talk, just to say that this is the last Emancipatory Futures visiting scholar input. In November, early November, we will have an activist scholar from Germany talking about the climate justice movement in Germany and the lessons we can learn from that climate justice movement. But the point about this platform is that we've straddled both the academy and critical thinkers who are grappling with futures questions to practitioners. And that's what we had. The last time we had somebody in this room talking about indigenous knowledge and the South African food system. And how do we reclaim that? So Emancipatory Futures is really a challenge to mainstream and dominant ways of thinking about futures. In the age of neoliberalism, our business schools, our corporations have literally invested in thinking the future, in thinking paradigms about the future, and of course developing bodies of knowledge about the future. So in other words, they even try to commodify the future. Emancipatory Future Studies is a rejection of that. And it's really about the subaltern, those at the base of society and how they are thinking about futures. So it's about their tacit knowledge. It's about their visions and their concepts and their ideas about the future. And so we have various thrusts in this project. It's emancipatory futures in the context of climate change. So climate temporality is a big part of this project. How does climate impacts change how we think about time? So social time is understood in very linear terms, and so on. But with climate change, many things are going to change. Seasonality is going to change. It's already begun. Various things are going to change in terms of temporality. The other thrust about emancipatory futures is that we also want to decolonize futures. So it's really about, again, futures that have been there but have been either pushed into the background or defeated or expunged from the imagination. So we really want to retrieve potential futures that have been there amongst, if you like, struggles of decolonization, struggles against slavery, and struggles against forms of racism. We're also trying to think about futures in the context of systemic pathways into the future. So subaltern forces are really building futures now. So Yanni, who's here, she's looking at waste pickers and how waste pickers are thinking about zero waste and circular economies. If we look at Charles Simane, he's looking at seeds and how we can take control of biogenetic resources and how communities have and how they are wrestling and fighting with corporations that are trying to steal this knowledge and to reproduce, if you like, local knowledge-based seed systems and so on. So these pathways are there. They're either being pushed back or they're being advanced and so on. So that's what we're looking at. We're also looking at utopia, dystopia with an ecological perspective. And there's a whole body of work around that as well. We're also looking at grand ecocentric futures, decarbonized civilizations, post-carbon democracies, just transitions, ecological civilizations. And hence, I want to introduce our visiting professor and guest today. Professor Christopher Chase Dunn is a distinguished professor of sociology and director of the Institute for Research on World Systems at the University of California, Riverside, USA. He is the author of The Spiral of Capitalism and Socialism with Terry Boswell, Rise and Demise, Comparing World Systems with Thomas D. Hall, and Social Change, Globalization from the Stone Age to the Present, Bruce Lehrer. He is the founder and former editor of the Journal of World Systems Research. Chase Dunn is currently doing research on transnational social movements. He also studies the rise and fall of settlements and politics since the Stone Age and global state formation. So, over to Chris.
Okay. Thanks, Vish. I've got way too much to cover. Did this handout get around? Okay, you can see there's a lot of topics on here, so I'm not going to actually try to cover them all. How much time do I have?
You have about 20 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to try to fit my discussion to what I think people might be interested in, but it's going to be a combination of what I'm interested in and what you're interested in, okay? So I'm going to try to convince you some things that you didn't think were that interesting are actually relevant for stuff you're focused on. And so I don't really know that much about who's here. I'm kind of guessing. I know some of the folks, but not the others. I will say that, okay, this is the same outline that you have there. I'm not going to go through the outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic ideas. Can everybody hear me? I don't think there's a mic in here. Yeah. The big idea is that the usual time horizons that we use in both social science and in global politics is short. And we're not the only ones. Most humans do this. But that if we can actually understand social change in a longer time horizon, it could be helpful to us in the present in terms of trying to deal with the situation that we're in on Earth now. I know you're focused on the future here, and I will say a few things about futurism. One is, in the Shang dynasty, in Bronze Age China, the reason that we know that the Chinese were already writing Chinese is because the king had a bunch of diviners who would hold tortoise shells over a fire, and the tortoise shells would crack, and then the diviners would look at the cracks on the tortoise shells and tell the king whether he should go to war tomorrow or not. And then on the back of the tortoise shell, he would write what was the question and what was the answer. So this is how we know the Chinese are already writing Chinese in the early Bronze Age, the Shang dynasty. But what they're doing, what these guys are doing, is predicting the future based on cracks and tortoise shells. Okay, so we're hoping we're doing a little bit better than that now, but who really knows? I mean, one problem with the future is it hasn't happened yet, so you can't really study it. But here's what you can do. You can understand sort of how human society does change, and here, you know, I'm a sociologist, but I work with historians and geographers and anthropologists and archaeologists and so on. But historians believe in the conjuncture, and also in that the important thing about people, they're sort of humanists on steroids, so they believe that each human is important and every human story is important, and so it's different in my village in the years between da-da-da-da. They're empiricists of particularity. Not all of them, but some of them. And we all need to understand the part of that it's important for the project of trying to understand the future, which is that really it's open-ended. Because there are conjunctures, there's things you could have never predicted. It's about the timing of things. There's a lot of cycles, there's a lot of trends, and the way in which they come together produce things that nobody could have ever possibly predicted. And that's what human history is like that. So when we're trying to talk about the future, one, there's no future. There's a bunch of possible futures. And some are possible and some are probable. So that's the world we're in, trying to say which ones are more probable, really. But not ignore the ones that may not be very probable, but they're possible, especially if they're important, like the one that the insight that the human species is now at a point that it could entirely annihilate itself. Now maybe that's not likely, but the very fact that it's possible is something that we do need to keep in mind, okay? There's a lot riding on what happens in the next 50 years on Earth. And the time horizon I'm going to be using is that. Namely, when I get to talking about the future, the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the last 50,000 years. And then I'm going to talk about the next 50. All right? Are you ready for this? That's what we're doing here. Okay? I'm not going to bore you with what's going to happen after that, although it's pretty interesting. We're not going to worry about it, okay? But we're going to kind of focus on things that our actions might actually have some impact on. And 50 years out is already a long time horizon, but I think it's important to have that in mind because the main comparison I'm going to make in my talk is between the first half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century, which hasn't happened yet. Okay? I'm talking about the next 30 or 50 years. But I want to do it by talking about the similarities and differences with what happened in the first half of the 20th century, which I think is the best chunk of human history for understanding our current situation. And not that we're just repeating what happened, but that it's similar enough that we need to pay attention to the similarities and differences. That's the big idea. But before I get to that, do you have anything else to say about this? Futurism? No. That's it. So I'm going to be talking about evolution. And this is a scary word for most social scientists, okay, because it hasn't had history in social science and in world politics, okay? Basically, theories of evolution were used to justify imperialism and all this. And so we've got to start with that problem. Okay? This is not new. I'm not really going to be talking about biological evolution, which is what most people mean by evolution. They're talking about genetic change, okay? I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about socio-cultural evolution. And I call it socio-cultural because something like this happened 30 million years ago with the ants. But they don't have culture. I don't know if you know anything about ants. I know most of you only study humans. But, really, I would say that you need to think a little bit about ants, because 30 million years ago, ants developed complex social, not hierarchies exactly, but the social division of labor. They learned how to farm. They did imperialism, okay? One ant colony goes in, kills the queen, substitutes their queen, and gets the other ant colony to raise all of its babies. I mean, that didn't even happen in South Africa. I mean, that's amazing. And wait, they don't have brains. Their brains are kind of a wide spot. So the brain of an ant colony is the colony. It's not the ants. It's it's the fact that colonies compete with one another that drove their evolution. Okay, they compete with one another for space, for resources. And that drove evolution in the absence of brains or culture. The colony is the brain, and the individual ants aren't. Okay, they have a simple communication system. I'm going to not talk about ants anymore. My point is that culture, we didn't do that. We didn't do complexity and stuff till after we had started living in our languages. We developed symbolic language. That's what made our evolution possible, okay? Because now you've got an animal that's communicating and living in communication structures and creating, reproducing social structures and institutions and all that, and living in its little fantasy world of language. It's a virtual world. And the humans started this about 50,000 years ago. About 70,000 years ago, some modern humans, Homo sapiens, on the southern coast of South Africa were making beads and doing rock art 70,000 years ago, okay? That's a level of symbolic communication that had never happened before in our species and never happened in other species. It's what it is language. And once you have language, it makes social learning possible, and it makes parents can communicate and teach their things to their children, and societies can live a mental life together and so on. It changes things. Then sociocultural evolution is changing that. It's not biological evolution, it's not what happens to genes. Now, it turns out biological evolution and sociocultural evolution interact with each other. It's not, a lot of social scientists think that once we jump to culture, we stop doing biological evolution, but it turns out that's not true. Biological evolution is still happening. Okay, there's big selection factors that are influencing our immune systems and all this stuff that are interacting with culture and other things, like the coevolution with microbes and all that. So we're still doing biological evolution, but it's not what I study. Okay, I study sociocultural evolution, which means what most social scientists study, right? It's culture, it's institutions, it's ideas, and it's the structure of societies and polities. Now, so the short version of what happened is the emergence in human societies of complexity and hierarchy over the last 50,000 years. So the first human societies were small scale, not very hierarchical. There's some hierarchy, but very little, and not very much division of labor. They're hunter-gatherers because you were either a hunter or a gatherer, and whether you were one of those or the other was about your gender. That's it. It's a simple division of labor. Okay. That form of a polity, I'm going to use the term polity rather than society, because polities are boundable in ways that societies aren't. A polity is just an authority structure. Nomadic hunter-gatherer bands were polities. Okay, they weren't part of a larger polity, they were autonomous polities. I study them because I study settlements. I'm interested in the camps of nomadic hunter-gatherers. I want to know where they were, how long they stayed there, and how big are they. Knowing about settlements, polities are authority structures. Settlements are places where people live. And nomads have a settlement system, but they move. But they don't just move. They come back, they go in circles. And you can see the evolution of settlement systems before the rise of sedentary societies. Because what happens is nomads start going in smaller yearly cycles. And their technologies change. And their camps get bigger. And they start differentiating their toolkits with each other from other toolkits. So the rise of identity and cultural difference and stuff is already happening. And toolkits among nomadic world systems in which everybody's a nomad. Oh, I need to mention the world system idea, which is this first slide. Okay. It's a system of systemically interacting polities. That's what it is. And what I study, the unit of analysis for me is mainly that. It's that system, because these are whole systems. They have a logic of their own, and when you go back in time, they're small. What happens is they get bigger, and eventually we have a global system that we live in now. But when you go back in time, there's lots of them, and they're little. This is good for comparative social science, because one problem with studying the global system is there's only one of them. And so you can look at change over time and stuff, but you can't really compare very well. Well, I solved that problem by comparing the modern system to these earlier, smaller systems. And the further back in time you get, the more systems there are, basically. They're smaller. So I was going to say, I study settlements, meaning camps, hamlets, villages, towns, and cities. Okay? And I'm a quantitative social scientist, and the good news is you can tell a lot about a world system by knowing how big the biggest settlement is. One thing you need to know. It's better if you know how big all the settlements are, but if you can't do that. If you know how big the biggest one is, you know a ton about its scale, and you can infer a bunch of things about its division of labor and all kinds of stuff. The other good thing about that is you don't need writing. to do it. You don't need documents. You can do it based on archaeological evidence, okay? So you can just dig and figure out how big the village was and how many houses there were and what the aerial built-up area was and estimate the population size of the camp. You got it? So now you have a quantitative scale measure of basically complexity. Okay. The other variable that I use that's usable across wide periods of time and in different places is the territorial size of the largest polity. Remember, a polity is an authority structure. So there, you can't do it with archaeological evidence, but you can do it with documentary evidence. So now you need writing. Somebody has to have said what the boundaries of this polity are. Okay? And you can't really see that with archaeological evidence. You can see where the settlements were and stuff, but you can't really see where political power fell off. Really, you're talking about a degree of real control and a degree of claim control. That's what territorial. That's what claims about authority are. Okay. And then we can quantify that. And what happens is you go from little ones to big ones. And we can study when and where that happened on Earth. Now, the fact that I'm dependent on basically compilations of data sets that allow me to see city sizes and poly sizes, and that for my purposes I need to have those estimates about every 25 or 50 years, means there's a whole bunch of the Earth I can't study because I don't have that information. So what I end up studying are 5 world systems where I do have that information since the Bronze Age. The 5 systems are Mesopotamia, Egypt, what I call the Central System, I'll explain what that is in a minute, East Asia, and South Asia. South Asia, East Asia, Mesopotamia and Egypt in the Bronze Age, and then what I call the Central System. I've got to get another diagram up here to explain something to you. I forgot core periphery hierarchies. Okay. Usually when we talk about the emergence of hierarchy, we're talking about hierarchy within polities, right? Hunter-gatherer bands don't have much, and then chiefdoms have more, and then states have more, and empires have more, and so on. The rise of hierarchy within polities. But I'm looking at a different kind of hierarchy. These are hierarchies of polities. That's what world system stuff adds here, okay? We're the only ones who really do this in a systematic way. And the insight here is, yeah, the modern world looks like that, but earlier world systems looked like it too, except that it emerged. And there's a relationship historically and evolutionary-wise between hierarchy within a polity and hierarchy in a world system. So core periphery hierarchies emerge. And I've studied world systems that didn't have core periphery hierarchies. So we don't say a world system is something that has a core periphery hierarchy, we turn that into a question. Does it have one or not? And if it does, how does it work? And the other thing is these are relational concepts. So what the core is depends on the way power works in the system and power itself evolves. So these are relational. To know what the periphery is, you got to know what the core is, and the semi-periphery is sort of in between, and it's always complicated. But, so you need to go see what's going on in a place and figure out who's what, and so on. The way we do this is we use population density as the main way for inferring what's going on here. But the first thing I wanted to say is there are world systems that don't really have them, and I studied one in Northern California. How many of you have studied a world system in Northern California? Not that many, okay? There was a world system in the Transvaal, okay, before the Europeans got here. And it was already emerging as a hierarchical world system. But when the San lived here, it wasn't very hierarchical. Although they were evolving too, okay, but slowly. So their population density was low. They were going through this sequence that I mentioned about what nomads do, which is their annual circuits were getting smaller and their villages were getting bigger, and there was an emerging relationship between more sedentary and more nomadic peoples already, before the pastoralists came down from the north. When the pastoralists came down from the north, that's a core periphery hierarchy, sort of, because the pastoralists have higher population density, they got more wealth, more food, more power. But the San are still around. So there's a relationship between the pastoralists and the San. And then when the planters come down, the farmers who are farmer pastoralists come down, that hierarchy gets more complicated. So this evolution is happening right here. Okay? In Northern California, we have sedentary foragers, sedentary hunter-gatherers. These are hunter-gatherers, but they live in villages. Sedentism happened before the invention of horticulture, of planting. Okay? People in some areas that had lots of resources were able to live in winter villages longer. That's what how sedentism emerges. We usually think of world systems as people have territory and so on, but nomads have a complicated relationship with territory, don't they? But sedentism, now you have the emergence of a system where you can see where the permanent settlements are and figure out where the boundaries are and all that kind of stuff. It's more like the modern world system once you have sedentism. But the point I want to make to you is that this happened before horticulture, before planting. There were sedentary hunter-gatherers, we call them complex hunter-gatherers. They lived in places where population density could be pretty high because they had a lot of resources. They could stay in one place, they didn't have to move. The reason nomads move is because they use up nature here and then they got to go somewhere else where it hasn't been used up yet. So there's a model here, and we call it the iteration model. And it's about population density and the effects that that has on resource use and degradation of the environment. All humans do that. And when after they do it, they have to do something else. There's population pressure, so they either migrate or they get into conflicts and kill each other off, which lowers the population pressure and the resources revive, or they invent new forms of organization that allow more people to live in the same space. We call this the iteration model. It's what's been going on for 40,000 years. But it's unfortunately slightly more complicated than that, because what also happens besides the iteration model is qualitative transformations in the nature of accumulation and reproduction of societies. So these small-scale societies are the kin-based mode of production. The kin-based mode of accumulation is basically people living in a moral order in which the world is composed of people you have obligations to and people that have obligations to you, and everybody believes this, and you want to be a good uncle, and all this stuff. It's kinship. Kinship is the social structure. It's education, it's the polity, it's the economy, it's everything. Okay? What happens, though, is as societies get bigger, that doesn't work anymore. That only works when everybody's kind of more or less on the same page. They're all speaking the same language and talking to each other a lot and can work it all out and everything. Once you get to a certain level of complexity, it doesn't work anymore, so you have the emergence of other institutions that basically over the tops of kinship. It doesn't get rid of kinship, it just, these things emerge over the top. This is chiefdom formation and state formation. Chiefdom formation is interesting because now you have hierarchical kinship, because original kinship is not hierarchical. All the lineages are equal. But what emerges is an inequality of lineages, the totem pole or the hierarchy of lineages. This happens in chiefdoms. And then that's good. You have a rise and fall of chiefdoms. So one of the things we notice about world systems is you have centralization and decentralization cycles in all world systems that we know of, okay? The rise and fall of hierarchies. So you've heard of the rise and fall of empires. We're in the middle of the rise and fall of empires right now, aren't we? Okay, it changes the way it works a little bit, but it's been around all along. And it happens with chiefdoms. There's a whole literature in anthropology about this, cycling among chiefdoms. A big paramount chief emerges, he makes deals with all his other chiefs, and they gotta supply his army and everything, but then it all kinds of falls apart and then back into smaller chiefdoms again. This happens over and over again. But what also happens, I got another slide here to show you. Oh, okay, this is the core-periphery hierarchy now. Well, we're going to get to this. Oh, this is my book. This is written for undergraduates in sociology, okay? But basically everything I'm saying today is in this book, almost, except for the part about the sun. I didn't know about them. Oh, God, yeah. Remember the thing I said about the central system? Well, this is basically a map of what happened if you start with Mesopotamia and Egypt in the early Bronze Age. So there was a whole world system in Mesopotamia, and that's the place on Earth. Does anybody know where that was? It's Iraq. Exactly. The first cities and the first states on Earth emerged there. The first city was called York. And after it emerged there because they figured out how to do large-scale irrigation, agriculture. And you had 2 rivers, and all they had to do is drink big ditches between 2 rivers and grow a lot of food. And then if you do that, you can have a bigger settlement and you can feed more people. The first of these city-states were theocracies. Okay, it was a social movement organized as religion, in which a bunch of entrepreneurs made up some story about how we are all slaves of the city god, and we're going to build a big temple over here, so you all come on and build this temple, and then we'll have feasts, and the temple will own some land, and it'll produce stuff, but you all have to pay the temple tithes, and it's a whole. The first states are theocracies, okay? But then copycat Yorks emerged all around, and you have now the whole valley of the Tigris and Euphrates gets full of these city-states, and then they start competing with each other for land, but also for control of trade routes, and then some of them start specializing in warfare, so now you have to have a king, a battle king, okay, to lead the soldiers, to protect your territory and stuff against the other ones, so a hierarchy between the temple and the battle king emerges, and he has to have a palace. So the structure of the city is changed, because now there's the temple and the palace. This goes on for thousands of years. A parallel world system emerges in Egypt, but it's different. It's a linear system because of the Nile. There's only one river. And transportation and communications are pretty easy, because really all you got to do is take a boat. The river is navigable both directions, but the Tigris and the Euphrates are not. It's very hard to go upstream the Tigris and Euphrates, but you can go up the Nile, okay, with a boat. So you have this emergence of first a multi-state system emerges, but it doesn't last very long. An empire formation happens early, and you have the Egyptian empire controlling the whole valley. So it's different. Both of the writing is different, but it's influenced by Mesopotamia that happens earlier. And then the Egyptian system has core-periphery relations with Nubia and all that. Okay, there's a little world system there. And then in about 1500 BC, right there, pointer here, I don't think so. Right there, the two come together. This is when they start fighting with each other. The metric I'm using here is geopolitical, okay? Some of you are international business people. It's if you're allying and fighting with other people in another system, then you're part of the same system. So the idea is a world system is systemic. It means you don't just know about people, you don't just occasionally do something with them. What you're doing with them is important. It's affecting your whole society, your economy, everything. And that always happens once you're fighting and allying with people, okay? It may happen a bit earlier too, because there's trade and there's cultural exchange and stuff like that. But the thing we can know about from history is when they start fighting on a line with each other. So that's what this guy Wilkinson uses, who does this. David Wilkinson, he's a political scientist, international relations, geopolitical guy. He believes he's a realist, as we say. Okay. Well, this is Bronze Age realism right here. You're looking at it. The two world systems merge, and after that, Wilkinson calls it the central. I call it the central system. He calls it central civilization. He uses the word civilization in a weird way. But it's really a political, military, it's an international system. The same thing that international relations studies, right? Except now you have one in which Egypt and Mesopotamia have merged into one system, and he calls it the central system. That's one of the cases that I'm using. So I'm studying Mesopotamia and Egypt, but now I'm studying the central system. Okay, and every time it gets bigger and incorporates other systems, I take that into account. It's my main unit of analysis here. Okay, and why? Because it's the one that took over. But there was another really big, important one called the East Asian one, and there was another called the South Asian one that existed for a long time. So I used those up until the time they got incorporated into the central system. I used those as other cases. So now I got 5. And the reason I don't do all the rest of these, which would be nice, is that I don't have the data on city sizes and poly sizes, right? Wilkinson actually has a whole thing about the West African world system and all this. Or political military network, we call it, because that's what it is. It's warfare and alliances. But I don't have data on city sizes for that one, so I can't do it in my analysis. We have a big project at UC Riverside where we're using these cases to study when both polities and settlements got bigger and when they got smaller. So we have estimates of their sizes about every 25 or 50 years, and when you go way back, it's every 100 years, which is not great. Okay, but at this point, that's as good as we can do. Am I doing it on time? I'm out of time.
20 more minutes.
All right. Well, here's two world systems coming together, the Central and the East Asian. Moving right along. Okay. I got to explain this to you. When we have these quantitative measures of settlement size and poly size, meaning the largest settlement and the largest polity in each world system, we can see the cycles, and we can see the upward sweeps and the down upswings and upsweeps and downswings and downswings. An upswing is it just goes up. An upsweep is it goes up to a third of the size larger than the earlier 3 peaks. Because all these things are cycles, okay? They're sizes, everything, there's cycles all over the place. But the question we're asking is, where are the upsweeps? Because those are the events that are our best indicator of the emergence of greater size and complexity. You follow me here? And we're studying settlement sizes and poly sizes separately and together. Okay? Got it? Now we have quantitative measures of the emergence of complexity in these 5 regions. So this is just a faked up diagram of what happened on Earth, not in any particular place. First you have very small scale systems, they're not on here. And what happened with them is hierarchy wasn't really rising and falling, but what was rising and falling was integration. There are trade cycles, and you can see them in the archaeological evidence, okay? Trade networks are expanding and contracting, even though there's not much in the way of hierarchy. This is already happening in Northern California, in the system that I studied. We went to in that neighborhood, we wrote a whole book on this. And I think this was happening in all these small-scale systems. There was a cycle, but it wasn't the cycle of the rise and fall of hierarchy, it was the cycle of the expansion and contraction of trade networks. And what is that? Well, it's globalization, except it's on a small scale. An expanding trade network is globalization. It's greater scale of economic integration. And there's deglobalization happening among Stone Age people, okay? In the sense that the trade networks shrink every once in a while and get reorganized. In Northern California, a trade interaction network based on a certain kind of beads collapses, and then another one emerges based on a different kind set of beads in a different, slightly different but overlapping space. So there's a whole bunch going on here. There's a lot of cycles, okay? These are cycles of rise and fall, and the point here is these are the upswings, okay? And also, you know, the rise and fall of modern hegemonies, the Dutch, the British, and the US are part of this. And tripping out into the future, this is probably still going to keep going on, isn't it? What's happened is the largest polities have been getting bigger. Also, the nature of power evolves and changes. The nature of imperialism and interstate relations evolve. But basically, the biggest polity on Earth, and in particular world systems, has been getting bigger for thousands of years. And if you draw this out into the future, it predicts global state formation, although I'm not going to say when that's going to happen, and it hasn't been looking all that good lately. So this is real data. This is not just some faked up graph that I drew. This is the largest polity in the central system, the central political military network, since the merger between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and including the British Empire, which was the largest single polity that ever existed on Earth. So it's what I said, it's a bunch of cycles with upsweeps. And a lot of these stories are the stories that you know if you know much about world history. Okay? I'm not going to talk about cases here, except I want to make a couple of observations. One is, despite that there's cycles and upsweeps and downsweeps, there aren't very many long-term collapses. The big one was between Islam and the Mongol Empire. You see it, that box? That was a long one. And there was a city-size collapse there too. So if you look at this over the long term, it isn't that there aren't any collapses, it's just that there aren't very many. And eventually, even the ones that there's a recovery. Okay? Let's keep this in mind. We talk about the 21st century here soon. Now, we want to not just describe these upsweeps, we want to explain them. And there's a lot of different theories about the emergence of complexity and hierarchy. What we find is that there's one idea that requires a world system perspective that explains a lot, but not all, of the upsweeps. And that's this idea of semi-peripheral development. And I argue with my friend Patrick Bond about this all the time, because we're concerned about what's going on now with the BRICS and all that. Okay, and whether this is progressive and blah, 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 blah. And there's two traditions within the world system perspective about the semi-periphery. One sees it as something in the middle that sort of depolarizes the system and also engages in sub-imperialism and is functional for the hierarchy of the system. Okay? And I don't claim that never happened, and I don't even claim it's not happening now. But what I do say is, when you look at history in the sense that I've been talking about, there's something else happening too, which is that some semi-peripheral polities are the agents of transformation in the sense of greater scale of both cities and polities. And the phenomenon starts with chiefdoms. Kamehameha was from the Kona side of the Big Island, where it doesn't rain. And all they had was sweet potatoes. If you're not already in the best place on the island, it makes sense to mobilize resources and take over. So what happened was a chief from the backside of the island from the junior lineage conquered the whole island. Then, with a little help from our friends, the British, he conquered all the rest of the islands. So most of the empire upsweeps, both chiefdoms, states, and empires, are this phenomenon, or not most, but at least half of this phenomenon of semi-peripheral marcher chiefdoms, semi-peripheral marcher states. Semi-peripheral marcher states, okay? This requires that we be able to figure out in the world system who's semi-peripheral, who isn't. And I already told you how we do that. It's population density. But we look at other things too, like modes of production. How many cows do they have? And are they planters or what? But the main thing we use is population density, which is indicated by the size of the settlements. Were the Latins semi-peripheral in Italy before the rise of the Roman Empire? What do you think? I know you've all been studying the Romans lately, haven't you? Well, you know, the Etruscans had cities. They lived in these hilltop cities. And they had language and they had all this stuff. And the Latins were farmers that lived up on the hill. And they said, no, that looks cool. We should have some of that too. So they did. And then they conquered the Etruscans. And then they conquered all the other Latins. And then they conquered the whole known world. Yeah. You know anything about the Aztecs? They're Chichimecs. You follow me here? Do we have any Mesoamericanists? They were nomads. They came down from the north somewhere, from a totemic place, and they lived on an island in the middle of the lake as some state that was already in the Valley of Mexico said, hey, why don't you stay on that island out there? I mean, they're not there. Go ahead. And then they claimed that they were descended from the Toltecs, because these were some creative people. And then they actually married into some of the families that really were descended from the Toltecs. And then they started renting out their troops as mercenaries to the other states in the Valley of Mexico. And then they rolled up the system. You know that phrase from international relations? Yeah. Okay, you want to talk about China? Right. There's too many examples here, too many great stories. Almost all the big empire upsweeps are semi-peripheral marcher states. And in the modern world system, all of the hegemons are formerly semi-peripheral powers. And Europe was semi-peripheral in the Eurasian world system. Okay? So there's something going on here. And it's not the same as a lot of the other theories about the evolution of complexity. The main other theory is called the node theory. It's communications networks and trade networks interact in a single place, and so that place has more information, it can recombine information, and so it comes up with new ideas, and so on. Semi-peripheral marchers, that's partly true, but it doesn't explain uneven development. Uneven development happens when the center keeps moving, because if the node theory were right, Mesopotamia would still be the center of the world, is it? No. There's some reason why the center keeps moving. And the reason is this semi-peripheral marcher state stuff, okay? The interesting thing about China is it doesn't move that much in China, but it does move back and forth. It moves a little bit. So this it's not the same everywhere, and I'm not saying it. I'm just saying it's an important thing, and you can't even see it if you don't have the idea of a world system. Okay, okay, world revolutions. Wait a minute, how are we doing on time? Now?
No, you have at least another.
Okay, this is sort of, comes out of Giovanni Arrighi, Emmanuel Augustine, and Henri Gunder Frank's book about social movements and world revolutions. The big idea is that world revolutions aren't like revolutions within the polity, okay? There's a huge literature, the social movement literature and sociology about that. What they are periods in hierarchical world systems in which there's a lot of rebellions, revolutions all over the place, and they don't really even know about each other, but who knows about them? the colonial office knows about them because they're trying to run an empire. So if it's a hierarchical system and you've got a core, the core knows that these things are happening all over the place. So they are connected indirectly through that. And that they change. They're they're a driving force in evolution because there's competition within the core. There's multiple core states competing with one another. And the ones that manage the rebellions and the revolutions in the non-core the best are the ones who succeed in the core and become the new hegemons. Okay, you got it? Yeah. And there's something like this happening in East Asia. I'm working on East Asia right now. There's cycles of unrest in East Asia for thousands of years. And the dynastic rise and falls are related to these. It happens in the West, and here are the years are, well, the Protestant Reformation was one, but it was before the modern world system started. Europe was global. It wasn't global yet. The East Asia wasn't in. South Asia wasn't in either. Okay, so it was Europe and its colonies basically in the 16th century. Okay, this is also the time where Wallerstein says capitalism is emerging and becoming the predominant mode of accumulation. The Protestant Reformation is totally important for lots of things, for the European Enlightenment and all this, but it's all about religion. Well, okay, but in the social movement literature, the people that did that decided that religion wasn't modern social movement, so we don't have to think about it, which is stupid. For one thing, European Enlightenment and humanism and science and all this crap are religions too. Sorry, I mean, they're my religions, but they're religions, okay? So, excluding religion from the understanding of social movements is stupid because most social movements are religion. I already talked about early state formation and theocracy and all that. Religion is a discourse about authority. That's what it is. It's a bunch of other things too, but that's the main thing, okay? The Protestant Reformation was a really important one, and it was the rise of the Dutch hegemony and the Protestant Reformation were wrestlers in the clinch, okay? The Dutch Revolution came out of the Protestant Reformation. I'm going to use this idea of world systems to talk about the present and the future, so I better get moving. I don't have time to tell you the story of each of these. 1789, that was a big one. But it wasn't just the French Revolution, it was the Haitian Revolution and the American Revolution. And later, Latin American decolonization. Okay? These were world historical events that were connected with one another. The Haitian Revolution was in part caused by the French Revolution. And it was soldiers who had fought in Savannah for the French against the British who went back to Haiti and led the Haitian Revolution. You following me here? Yeah. These things were actually connected with one another. What was going on was the revolutionary Atlantic was emerging. There were soldiers and pirates and sailors and all this stuff, and people were starting to communicate with each other. And a inter-societal, international polity was emerging in which it was hierarchical. There was also global civil society already existing, but it was the elites who were doing it. It was religious elites and statesmen and scientists. Okay, and they were already forming global political parties. Basically, the Jesuits were a global political party. I don't have time to tell you the story of all these world revolutions because we got to get to that. So we'll keep going. However, I do have to mention the last. Well, 1917 and 20XX are the ones I'm going to be comparing, okay? Because I already told you I'm going to compare the first half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century. 1917 is basically the labor movement with all of its variants: anarchism, socialism, communism, and then what happened with the Russian Revolution and the other nationalist revolutions, the Mexican Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. That whole period of world history is a world revolution in which there's a political structure to the institutions and the ideologies that are going on in the whole world system. And it has a middle that Wallerstein calls centrist liberalism, which basically comes out of the French Revolution, the whole distinction between left and right and all that. That keeps evolving in interaction with the global right, which in the beginning are big landowners and feudal people and all that stuff, but then that keeps evolving in interaction with the global left, which in the French Revolution are the modern, the nation builders, the Bill of Rights and all that stuff. 1848 is another iteration. 1917 is the workers' movement, but with all these other earlier things in it. And it's working out a little bit differently everywhere. Your own history here of that is very interesting, right? The big idea here is that the global left has its own culture, and that culture keeps changing in interaction with the global right and the centrist liberals. And all of these keep evolving, so the culture keeps changing. New movements emerge and get added, the old movements get reconfigured, all that. 220XX is the world revolution we're in now. Okay, I think it started in 1994 with the Zapatistas in southern Mexico, but pick your own. Okay. It was the global justice movement, the pink tide, all this stuff. The current wave regarding a lot of different movements. It's a movement of movements. And I studied this because I did research at the World Social Forum. We did 4 different surveys of attendees of the World Social Forum, and one in Porto Alegre in 2005, one in Nairobi in 2007, and 2 in the United States, one in Detroit and one in Atlanta. So I did survey research. Okay, I'm a sociologist, I get to do that. It's a pain in the ass. I wouldn't recommend it. There's a lot of problems with it, but you do find out some interesting things, and I'm going to show you some of the things we found out. Oh, I got to talk about this briefly. How am I doing on time? I'm running out, right?
I'll give you a few more minutes. Big story.
Well, look, there's cycles. This is modern colonialism. Okay, this is European colonialism. There's cycles of colonial expansion. The first cycle was the Portuguese and the Spanish, then the French and the British got into it. And there are waves of, we just count colonial governors. This all comes out of this guy that coded all the colonial governors since 1430. Okay, this is Soyuth, the first Portuguese colony in Africa. These are, the blue are the expansions of European colonialism. The red are decolonizations, colonial governors sent home. Okay? So you have waves of expansion, and then you have waves of decolonization. This is Latin America, what I already talked about. I see it as part of the World Revolution of 1789 that really occurred in the 1820s. Then there are some decolonizations, and then this is what happened after World War II. Big decolonization wave. Okay? What's going on here is the European interstate system is getting expanded to the world. So-called sovereignty in the global south, right? That's what decolonization is. It doesn't mean hierarchy went away, as you all know, because what happens is the nature of imperialism keeps evolving. Before any of this, we had territorial empires. Territorial empires mean you conquer your neighbors and you take over their land and extract potatoes from their cousins. Most empires were like that. There were a few colonial empires, meaning you conquer selected areas along the way away. Semi-peripheral capital city-states did that way before the European expansion. This is colonial imperialism. And then you have neocolonialism, which is different. And it doesn't show up in the same way, because the United States has 782 military bases all over the world. What's that? What are you going to call that? Yeah, call it whatever you want. It's something. the Dutch, the British, and the US hegemony. These are measurable. This is just a ratio of national GDP per capita to global GDP per capita, which these three hegemonies show up. It's just size and level of development relative to everybody else. This is US share of world GDP. It's not a ratio of GDP per capita, it's just what the percentage is. What the percentage of US GDP is of world GDP. So it's that blue line. And it's since 1820, so you can see the rise and the decline of the US hegemony. And that strange purple line is Europe, just adding up all the EU members. And you can see it's declining too. This is just one measure of hegemony, but it's an interesting one. This is globalization, okay, so trade globalization. I need to distinguish between the neoliberal globalization project, which is a set of policies and ideas that started in Southern California and spread to the rest of the world in the 1970s, versus how integrated is the world economy. And the best measure, but there's other measures of this, is the ratio of international trade to the global GDP, and that's what this is. And this shows that ratio from 1820 to about 2006. Okay, so the big point here is, yeah, globalization goes up, like a lot of people said, but it doesn't just go up, it also goes down. So there's periods of deglobalization. There's a big wave in the 19th century. This is that wave, and then it goes down to a low point in 1900, then there's a little puny wave up till 1929, and then there's a crash, and then this is what most people think of as globalization, that last rip right there, since 1945. But the point is, I'm not quite sure what's going on with this measure right now. I'm waiting for the World Bank, to come in with it. But Patrick Bond has other measures that show that we're probably entering another period of deglobalization.
McKinsey, but never trust McKinsey, but it's called global flows. McKinsey, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of people who have said this, but I'm pretty interested in trying to figure out. And since I'm a quantitative guy, I'm not going to let 2 or 3 data points tell the story, okay? I want to see what's going to happen, and unfortunately, it's going to have to wait. But I think it's quite plausible. And if you listen to global politics, it's pretty plausible that we're headed into another period of deglobalization. And this is not about ideology, and this is not about politics, it's just about how integrated the world economy is. Got it? No. It's structural globalization, we call it. Oh, yeah, this shows since that graph. So it went down in 2015, back up in 2016, and back up in 2017. So it's wobbling. And 2018 is not in yet. Or I haven't been able to get it. Patrick Bond has connections, so he'll get it.
In 1 hour, the Trade and Development Report from UNCTAD is going to be released in Victoria. So we'll
nice.
see the next stage, but it's all looking down.
So, I told you I wanted to compare the first half of the 20th century was a disaster. It was a really interesting disaster. Basically, it was a big disaster, okay? 2 world wars, the Bolshevik Revolution, lots of people killed, the Great Depression, all this stuff, things that affected everybody in the world. Eric Hobsbawm calls it the age of extremes. People call it a lot of different things. I wasn't born then. I was born right after it ended. I've lived in La La Land, okay? I'm from Southern California. You saw the movie. Everybody's like, oh! And I grew up in a period of relative peace. We had some wars and everything, but it was nothing like the first half of the 20th century. Nothing. Okay? It was really bad in some places, but not everywhere. It's this that we want to try to not repeat. But there's a reason to believe that despite the fact that there are important differences, there are a lot of similarities, and that one of the possible futures is the likelihood that we are going to repeat it. Let me talk about, I'm going to do the similarities and differences thing. Both had a period of hegemonic decline, but the hegemons were different. It was the British decline. Okay? The Boer Wars were imperial overreach. Cecil Rhodes's attempt to make the empire last forever and everything, but he kind of knew this wasn't going to work, but he tried hard, and you know, it evolved into the Commonwealth. That's what happened. The empire did kind of collapse, but they ended up with something. But the interesting thing there was the round table people that Rhodes was a part of. That idea morphed into the League of Nations when Wilson got hold of it. So for Rhodes, it was a commonwealth of English-speaking people. But once Wilson got it, he realized that that's ridiculous, so let's just call it a commonwealth. Let's call it the League of Nations. And everybody can be part of it, at least in theory. Not everybody was. In fact, the U.S. never joined. Because Wilson, well, he wasn't working, but he couldn't get Indiana to go along with this, okay? On the other hand, it was part of global state formation. The League of Nations was a international organization above the tops of the state system. And yeah, it didn't work very well and all that. But in the second try, it worked better. It's still not working very well, but in the second try, they figured a bunch of stuff out, and they kind of made it sort of work. And we're getting there today. So, global state formation has been happening since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. There was something called the Concert of Europe, which was the earlier version of the League of Nations. And it was kind of a mess, and it fell apart pretty soon over disputes between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who was a big supporter, and the British. But then the League of Nations lasted longer, and the United Nations is still with us. And all the other international financial institutions are part of global state formation. Okay? But they're not really states, are they? They're clubs. They don't have capacity that states have. There was a crisis of capitalist accumulation. And it was hegemonic decline, but it was the British, and then now it's the United States. Big difference between the British and the United States is the British were a much smaller part of the world economy and were a much smaller part of military power, global military power, than the US is. So what happened is the hegemon got bigger. A continental state won a war in Europe and a war in the Pacific at the same time. What the hell? What is that? That is the 800-pound gorilla, okay? Unheard of, ridiculous. And is still a huge percentage of the world economy and basically no competition in military power. Sorry, anybody that thought that was different. We'll fly something over you pretty quick and we'll talk about it, okay? You really want to play here? You'd like to be incinerated? So that's a big difference between now and what happened before World War I, isn't it? Yeah, there's the 800-pound gorilla there, okay? And you know what? That's good for peace, because nobody is going to be stupid enough to take that on and get incinerated. And that's a good thing in a period in which we have weapons of mass destruction and could potentially completely eliminate ourselves. The problem is, it's not sustainable because somebody has to pay for it. And right now, you're all paying for it because when you print money, you get slapped on the hand by the International Monetary Fund. But when the US Fed prints money, everybody uses it. It's world money. We print world money! Wow! But how long are people going to go wrong with that? That's the question. Basically, the United States is living on the fact that it used to be the real economic center of the global economy. But it hasn't been that for a long time. So we're living on the financialization, having all this stuff, but really, we don't do anything except financialization, okay, which is fart around with securities and stuff. Now, it could be different. So one of the possible futures is another round of U.S. hegemony. But think about what would have to happen. We'd have to reindustrialize the United States and produce things that people actually need and that we could sell to them and so on. It isn't that that's impossible. It's just that the powers that be in the United States don't really care about this. They're fine. They're doing just fine. Thank you. Now, isn't that people don't say these words about a new industrial policy that the current Democrats are talking about? But will it ever happen? I don't think so. Okay? Because Wall Street would have to be behind it, and they're not. So one possible future for the 21st century is another round of U.S. hegemony. The British did it twice, in the 18th century and the 19th century, so it can be done. But is this going to happen? I don't think so. Okay? Another possible, well, I was talking about differences between the first, that's a big difference. It's just a concentration of military power. What I was going to say about that, about being unsustainable, is it costs a lot to run this big-ass military machine and all, and keep way ahead and high-tech, blah, blah, blah. But it gets paid for because of this thing about printing money, basically, okay? The U.S. makes a ton of, the government taxes the financial sector and all that, so it's a big bubble, basically. And when the bubble goes down, and when people start accepting the dollar and there's financial crash and stuff, and they start trying to tax U.S. citizens to pay for this big military thing, no, it is not going to happen. So that baby is coming down, and this is what the Chinese say they want. But from a geopolitical point of view, it's kind of scary, because now you're back in a World War I situation, pre-World War I situation, where all the big countries have their military powers. And then you get inter-imperial rivalry. And the other big difference is, in the first half of the 20th century, oil was coming online, okay? Energy was getting cheaper. And that's just the opposite now. We have global climate problems, and energy's not getting cheaper, it's getting more expensive. Now, maybe that will change sometime, but probably not. It's probably going to continue to get more expensive. We're running out of oil, basically. We're using it all. And the part that's not used is costing more to get, so the price is going up. So it's a very different energy situation, and in that context, you get resource wars. Okay, we've already had some. The war in Iraq was one. And so there's a lot of incentive for a multipolar military structure for countries to use military power to get what they need and want. So that's kind of a scary situation, because that's how World War, whatever it is, number could actually emerge, and we all be gone, out of it, smoked. Now, the good news is we might not all get killed, like New Zealand or something, might escape. And that might be okay. I mean, it might take them a while to get going again, and everything in the north will be smoked. You already saw this movie, right? So we might not actually kill ourselves completely off. And if we don't, you know what will happen? The same thing, pretty much. Ignore the historical details. Complexity will emerge again. We'll get right back to where we are now and have to solve this problem again. What we have, though, is weak international organizations for resolving conflicts peaceably. That's the United Nations. Okay? It's not great. It doesn't have much of an economic base. It doesn't have a good tax base. It doesn't have military capability. It's not really a world state. It's a discussion club. So maybe we can just talk this through and we can all get along. And we should try that. That would be good. The other big difference is how many people there are on Earth. I mean, there's a demographic difference here. And the demographic transition has gone much further, but there's still a lot way to go. So the number of people on Earth is going to continue to go up. There will be more population pressure than there is now, and that's going to have a lot of consequences. Oh yeah, this is my research on the World Social Forum. What we discovered is in these 4 different venues, 2 which in the United States, 1 in Africa, and 1 in Brazil, 1 in Kenya, 1 in Brazil, pretty much the same structure of movements. Okay, what we did was we figured out how to see how all the movements, or movement themes that we call them, because we did survey research and asked people, what are you a member of, and what are you actively involved in? And then looked at the links. We did network analysis. That's what this is. And the same structure emerges in these all 4 venues, even though these are different years, different continents, and one of them is within the US, and the other 2 are global. They're all part of the World Social Forum process. I think you all know about this, right? You'll have to go by that time. So it's a global venue for the left to talk to one another about their movements and stuff. So we did these survey researches and we found the structure. Okay, what does this look like from a network analysis point of view? It's a multi-centric network in which there's a single network, there aren't multiple networks. All the movements are connected to at least some of the other movements. Okay? In order to make this diagram, we have to do a dichotomization of the measures, and so you end up with a bunch of points up here that look like they're not connected, but when you don't do the dichotomization, they are connected. So there's no movements. None of the 25 different movements that we studied, 28 or whatever it was, 27, were completely disconnected from the others, but there's a kind of a central and peripheral structure to this, right? But if you look at what's in the middle, we didn't have climate justice at this time. We had the environmentalists. So they can stand in, I think. So you can see who's aligned with who and what's in the center. And the same structure emerged in all 4 of these very different venues. So this is it. This is the global left right here. You're looking at it. It's a multi-centric collection of movements that are connected to one another. And other people have studied the discourse of the global justice movement and all this stuff. So there's a lot of research has been done on this. Fish.
Yeah, you can wrap up in the next
All
5
right,
minutes.
I'm wrapping up.
Okay.
All right. I'm just going to kind of wing it now. I got too many slides here. The problem with this movement of movements thing is that it reflects the culture of the global left, and the World Social Forum, I would say, is very much the culture of the global left. There are people who don't agree with that culture on the left, but there's actually a lot of consensus. The big ideas are really ideas that came out of the World Revolution of 1968 about participatory democracy and anti-hierarchy, so-called horizontalism, and prefiguration, the idea that we're going to create something here that's not really part of the larger capitalist system, but that prefigures the future, okay? And these are the projects that people are doing, and this is the ideology or the culture of the global left. The problem I see with that is it doesn't have very much political capacity to contend with the powers that be. And the people who do this have reasons for that. Okay. The big reason is that Leninism was a failure. Although most of them don't know that much about Leninism and that whole thing that happened. They think that Leninism was just a single party state that was hierarchical and da-da-da. Well, it was hierarchical, but if you study parties in the earlier world revolutions, they had lots of different organizational structures. Some of them were very democratic. But the point is, whether the people, the activists in the global left are right or not about their analysis of what happened, it's a reality. It's the culture that we have to live with. So the other bad contextual thing is the global justice movement was very interesting and inspiring and was based on crowdsourcing big demonstrations and so on, which has been going on since the World Social Forum was, well, before that, 1999 in Seattle. But these big demonstrations have an effect on global politics and discourse and stuff like that, but they don't really have organizational capacity. So the insight now is, well, the other things that happened was the pink tide in Latin America faded, the Arab Spring didn't turn out so good, except in Tunisia, that's dicey. So these movements that look promising in terms of some kind of serious challenge to global capitalism, at least in part, seem to be in some kind of trouble. And we are in a position right now where we need to think about new organizational alternatives. So Vish and I have been talking to a bunch of other people. Samir Amin, who was an Egyptian Marxist who worked in Dakar, Senegal, had this idea right before he died about, or he had it for the last 5 years or 10 years, about a fifth international. Okay? And a bunch of people now are talking about that, trying to figure out, well, can we organize a fifth international or not? It's an interesting discourse. There's a new internationalism bond that's been contributed to this forum that we published about people thinking about Samir Amin's proposal. And it's a really interesting forum that was published by Globalizations, the same journal that Vish and Michelle published. And it's available free on their website, so it's not part of the journal actually, it's just a website that's available. It was co-published by an African e-zine and by the Journal of Law Systems Research. So there's a bunch of really neat thinking about the possibility of a global party network that could coordinate local movements and national movements and this structure of movements. And I'm convinced that the climate justice movement could be the node, because one question is, so which of these movements could be the node around which to bring together the other movements? So the climate justice movement could possibly be that. It isn't quite yet, but maybe it could be. So there's a lot of work to do here. There's north-south issues. There's about the problem about who to include, who to exclude, and what to do about the existing global political parties. I would call them like Via Campesina and Greenpeace and so on. So there's a big organizational issue here. But I'm convinced that we need this, okay? In part because of the rise of neo-fascism and stuff, okay? But we need organizational capacity. It's not enough to just do our own little separate movements and stuff. We need to work together to both counter neo-fascism and to challenge the powers that be in global capitalism. The next futures, though, could be collapse. Maybe this won't work. Maybe things are really going to go to shit. The important thing about that is what I said earlier. Collapses earlier, yeah, some of them lasted a long time, but none of them lasted forever. The way in which this one could last forever is if we completely eliminate ourselves. But I don't think that's likely. I'm not very sanguine about a restoration of U.S. hegemony. I don't think that's going to happen. Although interesting things are happening in the United States. But I doubt that it adds up to, they're good things, but I don't think it adds up to a new U.S. hegemony. That would require a lot of consensus, of which there's little, and support from people that have money and power, and that's completely lacking. Although I'm not sure how the climate justice thing is going to come in. We had an earlier discussion. Climate justice thing is different from what happened in the 20th century because it's a threat, and you need to have a threat. But it's a threat that affects the class structure in a somewhat different way than the left. The left itself was the threat in the 20th century. The capitalists were going to lose their property. They all kind of brought them together and made them support fascism and stuff. Now, it's not that kind of threat. It's a different kind. It has different class implications, so we need to think that through. And I guess the other thing that's in this outline is it might be a transformation in the next decades to a new socialist mode of production or a new form of the tributary mode of production, meaning global fascism or something. Or it just might be another iteration or another Giovanni Arrighi style form of capitalism. Capitalism is pretty flexible, has been in the past, has lots of capability for adjusting to things. And so we could be looking at a new form of capitalism. I'm not quite sure what that would look like, I don't know. But I can imagine a global Keynesianism, that kind of a new deal on the global level, that sort of saves capitalism from itself. Okay, that's one possibility. All right, I'm going to stop here because I'm at grass.